Just to follow on from Peter's interesting talk, merci. He mentioned Minecraft as being very, very intellectually demanding. Well, I was reading the other day that in a university in the UK, physics undergraduates are actually encouraged to use Minecraft to increase their skills. So let's underline that is very, very interesting. Also, he mentioned that they learned some English. Well, I visited the Campania Sudbury School, type school, a few years ago, and I was surprised. I talked to all the children there and young people, and they all spoke English. And most of them spoke English better than English kids speak English. So they really had learned English. They hadn't had any lessons. They hadn't had any lessons in school, but they spoke English. Another thing about rules, they have lots of rules. And I do know that in Summerhill School, for example, they have more rules than any other school in the world, I should think. They've got over 200 rules to govern their democratic education. Some of those rules are basic ones. Other ones are about, if you borrow my bike without permission, you have to go to the back of the dinner queue. Those sorts of rules that are meaningful for children. But they are rules of a community that govern what's important in that community. Just one more thing on a slightly different note about Peter Hartcomb's school. What intrigues me, and I've got no answer to it, in the school it's free from parents. And when I visited, I asked Peter, do the parents come in sometime? Because my background is in home education. And he said, yes, about once a term. So that in effect, the parents come to visit once a term, something like that. He said, looking askance across there. But for a home educator, that would seem scandalous. Yet these children are happy in one setting and happy in a totally different setting. So it's back to the concept of being free to learn. Free to learn doesn't mean subscribing to an ideology, like extreme unschooling. You must do unschooling this way, or it's not unschooling. At one conference, I heard somebody who was close to a radical unschooler say, well, of course, if your child is running across the road and it's dangerous, you call them back. But otherwise, you don't do anything. And I thought, well, hang on, you've got to live, the kids have got to live with you as well as you live with the children. It's a mutual affair. So, unschooling, I've got on there. Free to learn, another phrase for it. Natural learning is the one that I like most. I think it's originally Australian, the concept of natural learning, the idea of it, because it's what children do from birth. From the first weeks, they're exploring the world around them. We saw it on the stage yesterday with Francesca's baby. They're exploring all the time. They're learning, and it's coming from them. It's a natural form of learning, which is curtailed at about the age of 5 or 6 when children go to, if they go to normal mainstream schools. It's also called child-led learning. I'm not sure about that, but I think natural learning is probably a good way of describing it, because natural learning allows for diversity of learning among children as well, so they don't all have to learn in a different way. Okay. When another thing about the Sudbury School, first of all, when I first read about the Sudbury School, the founder said that he was so excited at the way that his school seemed to be working that he thought everybody would want to know about it. And they didn't. And he was shocked and disappointed at that. he thought that, and I thought the same. When I started my research and got into it, I thought, everybody will want to know about this kind of learning. This was about 25 years ago. And yet, very few people did. They'd either be polite or they'd say, oh, you can't do that. There'd be all those sorts of responses, but nobody was really genuinely, hardly anybody was genuinely interested in it. So before I introduce the research that I've been involved in myself and with Harriet, can we get the next? Oh, yeah. Just a word about the educational establishment. I'm not into polemics a lot, but I do want to really criticize it extremely strongly. The educational establishment, let's admit, it's embedded in the human mind for about 98% of people. It's the children will grow up, they'll go to school. It's part of the fabric of society. It employs an army of people. Thousands, it's as big an employer as health, or if not more. It's huge. There are cleaners, there are architects, all sorts of people, professions rely on the educational establishment and the amount of money the government gives to education. More than that, it's become increasingly professionalized. Teaching, just over 100 years ago, required very little preparation. There was no pedagogy of teaching. The basic idea was, if you want to teach John Latin, you have to know Latin and you have to know John. Well, that's a step forward. But in order to teach, all you had to know was what it was you were going to teach. There was no science of pedagogy. How has that come about? Well, from just knowing your subject, then suddenly teachers were given a 2-year training. I'm talking about the UK, but presumably more or less the same in other places. So 2-year diploma, and then that became a 3-year diploma, and then that became a 4-year degree, a degree and diploma in teaching. And in the States, in some states, you need master's degree to qualify as a teacher. And more recently, the last 10 years or so, we've seen the appearance of the Ed.D., the Doctor of Education, the pinnacle of the profession, the pinnacle of the science of pedagogy, of teaching. And you have professors of the teaching of primary mathematics, of early secondary mathematics. You have incredible specializations. And they're all based on a falsehood. We'll come to that. Schooling has always been open to criticism, no doubt about that. People criticize it for bullying and for not teaching children as individuals. Even free thinkers, philosophers, have criticized schooling, but although they criticize it, they don't question the core belief that a curriculum directly taught, the core belief of mainstream schooling, that a curriculum directly taught step by step with age-related standards and tests is never questioned. I was sitting in a room in Birmingham University with Harriet, actually, and we were talking to the guy on the staff there, the lecturer who became one of Harriet's supervisors. And we were talking, and he was very sympathetic, a free-thinking philosopher. And then we suddenly, when he realized that we were saying that you don't need a curriculum, doesn't need to be step by step, the atmosphere changed. He didn't like that at all. I think he later on came to accept it, but then, faced with that, that is the bed that was questioning the very, very, very basis of education. So let's look at this core belief. Next. The challenge to the mainstream. Core beliefs are simply based on tradition and routine. There's no science behind them at all. They've just grown over time. These core beliefs of the curriculum, step by step, and so on. Give you another example. Harriet and I were interviewed for the Guardian newspaper by a journalist about informal natural learning. And in order to get balance, as they saw it, as she saw it, the journalist then went to a very eminent educational professor in the UK and asked him to comment. And he simply said, no, it's got to be step by step. You can't be completely informal and piecemeal. It's got to be step by step and taught step by step. So he didn't justify that. He just said that that's better. He said all the evidence shows it. Maybe in a school it shows it within the school only. So there's no scientific justification for it. In other words, it's an ideology and nothing more. The core of school-based education is based not on science, but it's no more than an ideology. Now, no one would want to admit that. An inspector coming into your house, if you're a home educator, and if you say, what you're telling me to do is based on an ideology, it's right because you say so, and that's all, which is it's borderline fascist, in fact. No one would want to admit that. So they fall back on, but it's based on evidence, based on science. And two things there. First of all, if it's scientific, then any science will always admit alternative explanations. When Albert Einstein came around with the theory of relativity, nobody said, no, you can't do that because there's Newton's physics is the end of physics. You can't progress. But there's an alternative theory, there's an alternative explanation. Of course you can progress. Now, if it's a science, you've got to admit alternatives. So they caught both ways, in effect. Is it an ideology or a false science? Well, in one sense, it is scientific, but only within the school setting is it scientific. It's funny, strange word, scientism. In other words, a false science. It's not a real science. It works within its own parameters, within the ideology is the only way it works. So you're going to teach, is it better to teach mathematics this way or that way? You can study that scientifically, but it doesn't apply in other situations, and that is the mistake made by by mainstream education. Okay, next one. Okay, that all sounds very good. Back down to we've heard the philosophers this morning, very impressive. I'm just an ordinary guy with, and show you how I came to my understanding of children learning. I started out as a true believer in the ideology. Most people are, and I was one of those. You believe that schooling is the correct thing. But I felt there was something very wrong with school, and I didn't know what it was. I thought a lot of time was wasted, various other things, but I didn't quite know what. So I thought, well, let's go back. Let's look, let's do the research, the desk research. I read a lot of the philosophers, and they all seem to come up with the same thing, that, basically, in order to teach John Latin, you have to know Latin and you have to know John. In other words, one-to-one teaching. You can't teach 30 Johns at the same, well, you can try, but you can't really teach, you can't know 30 Johns at the same time. I also looked at classroom research, and that comes up with the same sort of thing, that it's got to be one-to-one teaching. There's still teaching, that's still there, and I bought into that. I thought, well, it's one-to-one teaching, which is very important. So even people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his Émile, it's imaginary for a start, but it's also one-to-one. He hasn't got 30 Émiles that he dialogues with. He's got one Émile. And John Dewey had a classroom, a model classroom, as he called it, in Chicago at the university. And he argued for one-to-one teaching, but I think he had more teachers in his classroom than he had children, so it could be one-to-one still teaching. So I thought, how can I study this in some depth? So I thought the only way is to turn to home education. And I thought, oh, I'll study 4 or 5 families maybe in some detail to see how individualized teaching works out. And then, by happy chance, I discovered informal and autonomous learning, natural learning. How it happened, I was in, I'd gone to see somebody who's almost the father of home education in the UK, Roland Meehan. Some of you may have heard of him. And he was at Birmingham University. And I went to see him and I showed him an article that I'd published called Individualized Teaching. And he raised his eyebrows because he'd realized that he knew about natural learning. And he said, I've got a letter here from somebody who's offering for a student, one of my students, to come and spend a week living in. So I became, in my 50s, that student. I asked her if she'd mind if I came along, so I went along. So I spent a week there. And as I thought then, nothing happened. The whole week went by and nothing happened at all. Well, of course it happened. Lots and lots happened. But I am a slow learner. And it took me a while to realize. And it was about on the Wednesday that of the week that we were all sitting around a table and there was conversation going on. And it covered everything. Lots and lots of topics, some of them about can we go to the cinema on Saturday, some of them about can we get some cakes to eat for tea. But also what came up at the time was the Irish Republican Army and the problems of the troubles in Ireland. Nelson Mandela was discussed, all sorts of things. And I suddenly thought, wow, this really is something. There's not nothing going on. There's a lot going on. I didn't come to it quickly like Bernard Collot did from when he started. It took me it obviously took me a long time. So I then decided, during this week, there were 2 children. The girl was involved in, she doing a project of her own on child development. And there was somebody two doors down the street who was having a baby. So she was helping with her and at the same time learning about early child development. The week went by and we went out for walks, we talked and they played around, they did various things they wanted to do. But at the time, this was in the early 90s, and I've heard this from somebody here today, they did... Once a week, she made the children sit down for an hour or to do exercises in a book for the inspector in case he calls. So it was natural learning, but at the same time, trying to pull the wool over the eyes of possible inspection. So I then decided to go into, to look at all kinds of home education in much greater depth. And I carried out what I think was the first detailed study of approaches to educating at home ever, I think. But I was behind Bernard Collot, obviously. 100 families, mixture of the UK and in Tasmania in Australia. That was very, very lucky because I'd given a talk on home education in the UK. Although I was at the time I was working in Australia. I was working at the university in Australia. And when I went back, there was a letter on my desk saying they liked the piece about me in the Tasmanian Hobart Mercury newspaper. So I thought, oh, that's strange. They've picked something like that up. So I went to the State Library and looked for it. I couldn't find it anywhere. And then I was in world news, me. There wasn't much news, but the point was, at the time in Tasmania, they were facing rigorous control by the government, and they wanted to do something about it. So the press had cottoned on to this. So they offered me to come and do some research there, and that's how I started. And eventually I got 100 families. How did they get into home education? Well, this has been documented elsewhere. Some of the children are withdrawn from school for bullying, for falling behind, for being in front, for being bored. Some children, their parents, when they reached 5, decided that they were progressing very well and continued. Others had read people like John Holt, and so they decided from very, very early on that they were going to do it. So, whatever their approach, formal or informal, they challenged the mainstream, and they were. You've heard this before today. They were from the very formal end to radical unschooling. Virtually, I don't think you can have total radical unschooling, but virtually radical unschooling. And I came to This conference, this colloquium is about natural learning and unschooling. But if a family is practicing more formal education and that suits them, including the children, I've got no problem with that. But obviously, what I was interested in was with the more informal ones. But they all challenged the mainstream, and they all gravitated to being less formal. That was the big finding that came out of the study. Everybody moved in that direction. The typical thing was for a family, parents who've taken a child out of school is, oh God, it's Monday morning, and what am I going to do? And so some of them would say, well, do what you're familiar with. So they'd start with a school-type timetable at home. And after a week or two, they'd all burn out, because you can't keep that up for very long. So they all became less formal over time. And even the formal ones, there's a lot of natural learning in formal home education, in fact, because, it's not like school where the lesson starts and you're on task the whole time. If you're at home, it's broken up, as you are in work. You chat from time to time when you're at work. And so the parents, usually the mother, you chat with the child. And so it gets more and more informal. For me, the parents who started out quite formally and then discovered informal learning, they're the real scientists. As Bernard says, you are the scientists. Absolutely true. They were truly scientific because they were following on from their experience and reacting to it in a rational, completely rational way. How did this come about? Well, as I said, if you start with a formal teaching kind of curriculum, and you burn out. Typically, the parents reduce to about 2 or 3 hours a day at the most. But the rest of the day, the children were active, were productive, active, following their own interests, playing their own games, doing all sorts of things, and seemingly learning just as much outside what was being taught formally. But the best contributors to this move towards more informal were the children, because the children resisted being taught. They had their own theory of learning, which was not about being taught, it was about doing things for yourselves. They weren't articulating it, but can you imagine, you're sitting down with your child and you're worried about, will they learn enough? So you start talking to them and trying to teach them, and they go glazed. Now, you can't continue. It's stupid. You can't just keep on and on and on. Well, in a school, you do have to keep on and on and on. You've got no choice, because you're hoping that, you're expecting some of them will be listening. But most children have developed the ability to look as if they're listening, I wonder how many of you are doing that now. To look as if they're listening, and they actually are not. Reminds me of a lovely story I was reading the other day about somebody reminiscing about his childhood. He said he used to get up in the morning, put his school uniform on, go to school, sit down at his desk, chat to his friends. The teacher would come in. The teacher would start talking, and he'd be out of the window. And he wouldn't come back until the end, until the break time. In other words, he'd go off into his head, into his imagination, into his own world. So he was resisting teaching. So the parents would say, these are just two quotes. I do have lessons, but this is for my benefit. This, still worried about the having to be formal rather than theirs. They'd pick it up anyway. And we do exercises, I've mentioned this, from the school book for an hour or so in case an inspector calls. So some of the families became totally natural and informal, but they hadn't done it for any ideological reason. They'd come to it through their own scientific insights and progress. Can we go to the... Yeah. And how the inspector looks at this. And you have to understand the other side. An inspector, whole career, 4-year degree, diploma, master's degree, what have you. And then he sees something when he says, I'd be ashamed if I let my children do nothing all day. You've got to try and, if you want to get him on side, you've got to try and understand where he's coming from. So, what fascinates me, and still fascinates me, and I'll go to the grave before I got any answers, is how do children learn so much without being taught? So this inspector, he said, what do you do for writing? What exercise? What books have you got to show writing? And she said, oh, they write when they've got a reason to write. And on whatever paper they can find that they want to write, if they want to write. And that's it. What about maths? Oh, we go shopping, they do this and that, they pick up this, that, here and there. So the inspector was even more worried. And she said, in general, what do we do all day? We hang out. And that's it. You know the meaning, hang out? Yeah, in other words, we don't do a lot. So how do they learn so much without being taught? Well, children are interested in the world in which they live. And suggested that they're predisposed to acquire the knowledge of the culture in which they are born into. And they set about it from birth with great, great determination. They want to wash up the dishes. They want to vacuum the floor. This is, 1 or 2 years old, they're trying to do this because this is what they see. It's part of the culture around them, and they want to be part of that culture. And most mainstream people would admit that, but they'd say, until you get to the intellectual parts of the culture. But for the children, the intellectual parts and the rest are totally interwoven. So things like reading are just, Harriet's going to talk about that in some detail, can be just picked up without the children realizing virtually that they are picking it up. They're obviously pleased when they're reading, I'm sure, but they will pick it up, and they pick up number. Somebody said this morning, we are surrounded by words and numbers and so on, and children will pick these up. Of course, they won't pick up trigonometry unless they show an interest in measuring things, in which case they might be introduced to it. And it raises the question of why the mainstream school teaches things just to fill up teaching time. So they say all children must learn trigonometry. I learned trigonometry. I found it very useful because I could help my son when he was in school and he did trigonometry. And he'll teach his son in school and so on and on and on. But to never use it, it's not to deny that it's important, but it's important if you're following an interest through and it arrives there. The parents, you'd think, they say, oh, it's parents are not fulfilling their duty if they don't teach their children. But it's much harder to teach them to a curriculum. Maybe it is, but if you think that it's easy to be a parent of a child who's learning naturally through unschooling, whatever, then it's not. My wife and I, we have our grandchildren 1 or 2 days a week, 5 and 8 years old. We pick them up at 10 o'clock, and that's interesting. We pick them up at 10 o'clock. We can't get them away from their house to come to our house until about 11 o'clock because they're busy doing whatever they're doing. And it's a job to get them to come out. And so they're not totally free because their dad wants to do some, he's working, he's the guy he's the one at home. My daughter works, he's the one at home because he wants to get on with some of his part-time work. So, we take them home at about 8 o'clock in the evening, and then we go home. And I tell you, that gin and tonic is the best I've ever had. It's totally enriching and exhausting. So the parents are there, and it's totally different from the Bernard's school or Peter's school, but they both work, and I find that absolutely intriguing. It's not sequential. That's fascinating, I think. It is, in other words, curriculum logic. There is a logic to the curriculum, but it's an adult-imposed logic on the curriculum. The child's logic is different. The psychological logic of the child, with all the infinite number of connections in the brain, as we heard this morning, so massive that how they will learn something is totally different from the way another child will learn something. And it may not be sequential. It won't be sequential, in fact. And yet all these tiny little bits and pieces of learning, they come together. They coalesce into a well-rounded, well-educated young person. So at the time, I felt I had to try to prove it. There was in Australia, there was a girl who was learning primary school. There was a girl who was being unschooled, and her mother got obsessed with informal learning, and she recorded everything they were doing, day in, day out, for 4 years. And then she said to me eventually, she gave me this pile of school-type exercise books full of her writing and said, there we are, go and analyse that. I thought, oh dear. But I was quite crafty, quite clever, so I took out everything to do with maths that I could find in there, and everything to do with number. And I recorded all that, and I described that in the book, in my first research book, and with tiny bits and pieces. There were things like she got interested in money because she liked money. So she got interested in it because she liked it. She was far beyond what they would be in school with understanding money. Other things she didn't know at all. But she gradually, over the years, through tiny little things, managed to pick up what she needed to live sort of as a 11-year-old would know the maths that an 11-year-old would know. And her mother tested her when she was 11 with the primary school maths age 11 test, and she got about 80% of it, and she'd never, ever had a maths lesson. And all I'd found were tiny bits and pieces in there which didn't add up to anything. Totally non-sequential. And yet she'd learned that math. But then I now realize that that's not the point. That's not the point at all. It's meaningless to compare with school. I often asked at conferences, how do you know that they would be okay, you know, that they're up to a school level and so on? That's not the point. It's a lifestyle which is different. It's a different paradigm altogether. Okay. That book, by the way, it's in English and it's in German. Bildung zu Hause. Is that right? Okay, so the book with Harriet now. À l'école de la vie, Informales lernen. Oh, I'm trilingual. We proposed that there was very... I tell you before I start on this, we explored informal learning in much greater depth with 26 families. We discussed with them how they thought their children learned to try to explore it in more depth. And we proposed that there's an informal curriculum, which is simply the culture around us. And some comments from some parents. She doesn't seem worse off than any other child who goes to school for all those hours every day. She picks up the same knowledge, the same necessary information. Or I think they're processing information all the time and working out what it really means to them. I was sitting in a car with a mum and a child at the back, and suddenly the child says, when I'm 14, she's only about 7, when I'm 14, my cousin will be 22 or something like that. And the mother said, how do you know that? She said, oh, I work things out in my head all the time. And she said, all she was doing, we thought she was just sitting in the back of the car doing nothing, but things are going on all the time. Another parent, this is the funny thing about autonomous education. You have these massive peaks in certain areas and then what appear to be gaps in other areas. But they do all eventually fill in. Having said all that, 3 o'clock in the morning panics. My daughter gets them. And I'd be quite honest, when my grandson was getting to 7 and he wasn't reading, I began to, is he all right? And so on. You know, you can't help your own the massive power of the mainstream juggernaut that is powering through you. And this one who mentioned 3 o'clock in the morning panic, she was the one who gave advice to other home educating parents, don't worry, it'll work out in the end, to other unschoolers. And she was the one, and she was having her own panic, so it's very natural to do that. And learning does not require teaching. Okay, next one. Okay, the more intriguing one, how does it all go in? We thought we were going to come up with some new and exciting concepts, you know. Well, first of all, you've heard this one, doing nothing, like the girl behind us in the car, just doing nothing. Children are processing, we think they are, processing information all the time. And they come up with new things all the time. The grandchildren do that. They come up with things. Where on earth did they get that from? They've picked it up somehow or other. And that might be, that's the least one. It looks the least of these, but it may be the most important, actually, when you're just doing things in your own mind. Observation, obviously you're picking up from what you see and hear around you and processing that. Now, you can't do nothing in a school. Well, you can, but it's not easy to do nothing. And the whole thing for a teacher, you must be on task in school all the time. You must be doing something. But we are saying one of the best ways of learning perhaps is doing nothing. Observation. The only time you learn from observation in school is what other children are doing. And when a teacher is telling you, now watch this, now that's very different. That's not natural observation. That's prescribed observation. Conversation, that came out as the most, maybe not the most important, but very, very important thing that the parents stressed. As one of them said, it can take It can take an hour and a half to walk down the street. And I keep bumping into lampposts because we're chatting all the time. Another one said that her son, who was about 8, she said, I was fed up with him asking questions. And in the end, I said, look, stop asking, leave me alone for a bit, stop asking questions. And he said, yeah, but that's my job. So conversation and questions, very, very, it's all part, it's what they were doing when they're 3 or 4, but they're doing it when it's 7, 8, 9, 10 in a different way, moving towards more independence, but they're doing it for themselves. Another one, following an interest that you have. Children come up with all sorts of interests. And sometimes these can lead to, which this could never happen in a school. There was a child in Tasmania who discovered he was about 12 or 13, discovered a new species of snail. And it was he got coverage in the national press and everything. He got interviewed for the TV and that because he discovered this at 13, 14, and he was so excited with this. And he was fascinated by snails. So he asked if he could go to the local government science place, and so he went along there. And they were very nice to him, and he said, "Could he come and?" He was home educated. Can I come spend a couple of days here a week? No. Come back when you got an honours degree from the university, they told him. So that's so sad. They killed that off. One boy just did nothing but chemistry for years and years and years. And he eventually went to to study for the equivalent to the bac or the abitur, and he took part in the World Olympiad of Chemistry for 16 or 17-year-old students. And people criticized it. Oh, all he knows is chemistry, but he was good at everything else as well. Where that had come from, I don't know, but he's obviously picked them up. Another one became a vet. I talked to her. She was 18. This too was in Tasmania. She said she was in the first year of veterinary science at Melbourne University. Very difficult to get in because it's very popular. And I said, well, what did you do in your, before you? She went for 2 years to school before university. What did you do before? She said, climbed trees, went swimming, played cards, did Monopoly, read books, talked, and that's about it. But her mother she liked school. She said, I believe in school, you start when you're 16. So she said, well, what do you want to do? And she said that what she'd like to do to be a vet. So they looked up what you had to do to be a vet, because you've got to go through the hoops now. You can't just rely on natural learning. So she found out that she'd have to do year 10 in Australia, maths. And so they got a book, very good book, which starts, it's a book for people who dropped out of school. So it starts at the very beginning of arithmetic, maths, and goes up to year 10. And she studied that. And she went through the first 7 or 8, 9 chapters, easy. And she came to chapter 10, and suddenly there were no numbers. It was just letters. It was algebra. And she said, what the fuck is this? And that's a quote. As she told me. But do you notice, she didn't say, oh, what's this? There's a confidence that she'd be able to do it. And she did it. So she had to do it. And she wanted to do it for a reason. And she did it. And she went to the 2 years of school, and she got into Melbourne University. Music is... A lot of them seem to go into music because they get plenty of opportunity to play, to go into either classical music or into bands or jazz or whatever. Because they get the time to play when they want to play rather than practice when you have to. There are lots of other examples. Practice. One dad told me that he was outside his children's bedroom one night, and he could hear them inside. I've forgotten, 4 and 6 year olds old, I think, and they were counting up to 100. So he said, they're practicing there. You know, these are, they're doing it for themselves. So there is practice you think is important in school. My grandchildren do the same drawing. Once they've done a drawing, they do the same one over and over and over again, and then gradually they improve on it bit by bit. So they're teaching themselves, they're practicing. Play. I missed that out in my first study. You can see how narrow I was, how narrow-minded I was. I was more of a bigot, really. But play and the imagination. Imagination, I don't know why it is, but imaginative play is... if the kids think it's important, then it's important. And they play all day. They're in their imagination. And if it's important to them, it must be incredibly important. All children, whether they go to school or not, are in their imagination. Not as much of an opportunity unless they're out of the window in the school classroom. But I don't know why it's important. I mean, as a scientist, psychologist, I'm fascinated by it. But the more, and this goes through everything I've done. The more I learn, the less I know. And in a way, that's satisfying because that's what makes it so exciting. So in other words, how does it all go in? It's just growing. I'd rather have a simple explanation. It's just growing up in the world. So next, how do you convince the mainstream? Understandably, abandoning your preconceptions is very, very difficult. My daughter she works in the same university as me, and said she was talking to somebody who asked her about her children in school, and she said, no, they're home educated. And he said, oh, really? What about professional input and so on, and tests? And she said, well, you're going to have to abandon some preconceptions here, she told him, because they don't do anything related to any kind of formal at all. And he couldn't believe it. Now, you know, there are people who, as I said, the vast majority of us, as a whole population, we believe that in the mainstream, including the professionals. It's very, very difficult to abandon your preconceptions. I was at having dinner with a few people, and one of them was a primary school teacher who'd come to the end of teaching. So when I told him, we talked about what we did, he got angry with me. He said, you're telling me that all my years that I've been a teacher are wasted. I said, well, I tried to be nice. Well, look at it, it's a different way, I said. You know, it's just a different way of doing things. But he got very angry. Court cases, trying to persuade judges, you get the odd judge who listens, but mostly they don't. One judge, I was involved in a court case in Dublin, and one judge, he tried to be nice to this person. He said, what I want you to do, I said, you can home educate because it's in the Irish Constitution, you can home educate, but it has to be done properly. So I'm going to get an inspector to come and visit you and tell you how to go about it. So the inspector went along and he took the Irish National Curriculum book with him, about that thick, and he planned with her. Lessons, 5-minute recess here, 5-minute recess there. You have to do PE. She said, well, we go to the park and he climbs all over everything. But that's not PE. That's not physical education, he said. That's play. That doesn't count. So he wanted her to do exactly the same. But I met him a few years later and he changed completely. And I don't know what happened, but he had changed. People will change. Explaining helps, but some people refuse to accept it. My brothers and sisters still ask me, are you teaching them today? They can't see it as are they coming to you just to be with you? But are you teaching them? Are you tutoring them? And one of my sisters said, is he reading yet? You know, there's one we've heard so many times. Yeah, people listen, but they don't take it in. Sometimes in a colloquium such as this, the people you want to convince don't want to come. I don't know why, but they don't. I don't know if there are any here today, I don't know. But generally, they don't come. They get invited. I've been to conferences where they've sent out loads of invitations to the education department, the official education department, and nobody turns up. I think the only way is to let people be exposed to home education. I've got a doctoral student who's just finished his thesis, and it's a doctor of educational psychology. And in the UK, educational psychologists are the ones who deal with kids who are badly behaved in school or who refuse school and try to get them back into school and advise teachers on best ways to teach and so on. And he came and he said what he wanted to do was to interview home educators to find out, to improve the way to work out how education psychologists could guide home educators. That's how he started. A few weeks before he finished, he decided to change the title of his thesis to what can educational psychologists learn from home educators? So he'd been exposed to it. He'd organized focus groups and talked to lots of people, and that's what he came to. Social development. That's the hoary old one that's always sort of brought up, that children don't get opportunities for social development. And in my first study, I found that there was a little bit of truth in that. But when you think of it, when there are not many people doing it, a child maybe feel a little bit socially isolated, but generally not. In London, where I live, there I don't know, there must be 40, 50 groups of home educators just in London area, at least, I should think. And lots of others, or informal groups and so on. My grandchildren, they Skype their friends and so on. So there's plenty of opportunity. They go out a lot. In fact, if you ask them, would you like to go out somewhere? No, they want to stay in. Even on a hot, sunny day, they want to stay in and play. They don't want to go out. Sometimes we have to say, okay, bugger this unschooling, you're coming out, right? Because we want to go out as adults. There's that feeling that they must be deprived socially. I was interviewed for a BBC news programme, and the guy who interviewed me, it was a recorded interview. He said it lasted about an hour. He recorded it, and then I knew he'd select what he wanted to use, and he kept on and on about various things, trying to find out what was wrong. And I did mention that in my first study, some people had mentioned that they felt socially isolated. So in the program, all I got was about a 30-second clip. Dr. Alan Thomas said the children might be socially isolated. That's all that came out of all that 1 hour interview. Okay, concluding. It works throughout the world in ever-increasing numbers. I've been in Australia, the UK, Ireland, throughout Europe. All the unschoolers seem to be the same. They don't differ. You think they might differ from different countries. Harriet and I were in Colombia, in Bogota, and they were, the home educating group. They were mostly unschoolers, and you related to them just as you would here. Concluding, in the end, simplexité. Thank you, Bernard, for that one. It's so very simple. It just happens. And yet trying to understand it is unbelievably complex. There's no doubt it's a good basis for formal education later on. It's probably a better preparation, because with freedom goes responsibility. You're autonomous. That means you're responsible for yourself. So you decide what it is you're going to do. And then you will have to jump through hoops, through formal hoops maybe, to do what you want to do. But a surprising number, and I've got no evidence for this, a surprising number become entrepreneurial and get into some kind of business or other. I think that this has been found in the Sudbury schools as well, because these children have the confidence to do it. And it's totally inappropriate to measure progress against age-related norms in school. If a child is not learning to read I'll leave this mostly to Harriet, if they're not learning to read at 7, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they learn to read naturally, then they learn to read without any problems. And when in the UK, they start at 3. My wife used to be a nursery school teacher, and they started 3, and the object was to get them by the end of the year, by the time they 4, to write their names. So at the beginning of the year, hardly anyone could write their names. So they go on and on and on and on and on. At the end of the year, they can all write their names. Progress. After 1 year of being taught to write your name. Yeah. And it's a different paradigm anyway. It doesn't matter if you don't learn to read. It doesn't matter if your maths is at a so-called year 11, age 11 standard when you're 17. You can go later. You can study it later on. If you want to go to university, you don't have to go at 18. You can go at 20. You can go at 25. You can go at 50. You can go at 70. So I'm still left, with some questions. Are these children really free to learn? Are they guided by the informal curriculum, by the world around them, obviously, in that sense? This is maybe more true that they're less free to learn in home education than in Sudbury-type schools. I don't know. Because I see myself, you're drawing attention to things. You don't have to do them, but you are drawing attention to them. Children learn what's important to you. When they were 2, they could see that vacuuming and washing up were important. By the time they're 7 or 8, they can see that reading is important, maybe. So maybe you are certain things you think they should know. There's certain things which are part of our culture that we expect children to know, like where countries are on the map and so on. So you put a map on a wall, and now and then you go, I found myself going to this map and saying, oh, look, I used to live there in Darwin in Australia. And at the back of your mind, you think, well, I wonder if you don't know if he's picked it up. You're not going to test him afterwards, but you are, in a sense, guiding them. I'm nearly finished. Is there even more direct teaching than there would be in school? I think there might be. A colleague of mine at a seminar once said, when I talked about informal learning, he said, I think you do more maths at home than you do in school. But it's when you're asked questions, you answer, and maybe you teach, but you only teach as much as they want. A common finding is children will ask you a question, and you start to answer it, and then you go further with the answer. But by then they are lost interest and they're gone. They got what they want out of it. So that maybe there is some teaching. Do they miss out on a broad curriculum in school? I don't think so at all. But it's a question that's often raised. In fact, there's no entity of knowledge. In England, I'm sad to say there's a huge emphasis on kings and queens. Why kings and queens? I don't know. And politics and so on in history. And on First World War and Second World War. Those are the big things in England. First World War and Second World War. Lots of other things they're not mentioned even. Don't mention the British Empire. No. We were very good then, so don't leave it at that. Yeah. Why is imaginative play so important? Oh, that is so intriguing. It's fascinating. I don't know why, but it is. Finally, might there be children who prefer formal learning? I don't know. The last one. Yeah, my own grandchildren have taught me more than all my research put together, I think. And it made me wonder more and more about how children learn. It's an ongoing process in my mind. And the more I've learned, as I've said a few times, the more I learn, the less I know. But that's what science is all about. And thank you very much.